Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland brothers. Come on, me in it and join in the fun. Travel all over Australia.
Today we're going to show you how saddles are made over here at Elizabeth, not far from Adelaide.
And then we go to Gosford in New South Wales, here on the coast, and we step back 200 years to the early part of Australia's settlement. There at Old Sydney town we see recreations of what life was like in early Sydney.
We have a letter here from J. McGorm, the Adult Education Officer at the Elizabeth Technical College. Mr. McGorm wrote and suggested that we do a story on Ken Howard, a saddle maker here at Elizabeth. So we've come to meet Ken and see how he actually makes saddles. To start with, Ken has to go out and measure the horse to make the saddle to fit properly.
Donna Reed has commissioned Ken Howard to make a new general-purpose saddle for her horse Lincoln.
That's how we get the arch, can you see, for the tree. Get the correct fitting.
Ken is a craftsman and particular about the measurements. The age-old saddlemaker's art is carried out in Ken's home workshop in his backyard at Elizabeth Downs.
Well, I've been and measured this horse, this particular horse, and what we do is we see the rider and the size of the rider and naturally the size of the horse, but particularly in the horse, in the front of the horse is the withers, which we put a piece of lead pipe across to get the shape. Then we find a tree that will fit that shape. That means that the horse will not, the saddle will not have any undue pressure on the horse's back. Well, that's the tree will do well. That's a tree just came from the makers. It's a British tree made out of laminated beech wood. These two pieces are the main pieces on a saddle. These two cross pieces from the pommel to the cantle, they take the whole weight.
Ken Howard comes from a family of saddle makers. He learnt his craft in England. His grandfather was a saddle maker, so was his father. Ken carried on in their footsteps and opened his own saddlemaker's shop before emigrating to Australia. After the basic seat section of leather has been stitched onto the wooden tree, the side pieces have to be checked for shape and size before sewing.
I'm now going to what we call prick it. It's making the stitch marks regular. I'm pricking at 8 stitches to the inch.
The pieces are tacked to hold them in place for sewing, and Ken waxes the thread before he starts.
The saddler's clamp, that's to hold the leather. You put that between your knees and it holds the leather rigid while you sew it. You watch. Like that.
It takes a full week's meticulous work to handcraft a saddle.
This is awfully slow, but it makes that there's a stitch each side. With machine sewing, there's a thread that goes at the bottom and a thread at the top. If a machine stitch wears, it's liable to come undone. But hand sewing, this one keeps going right the way through. The only drawback is it's awfully slow. The most you can do is 4 feet an hour.
Every part is handmade, even the girth straps.
This is what we call pointing the strap. That assists it through the buckle, if you know what I mean. All edges are sharp when we cut them, like that. We take an edge off them with what we call an edge tool. You know. It gives them a rounded effect. That thing goes through the buckle better. Having cut the leather, one tries to polish the edges up, and that means staining them and polishing them. Well, one can't afford to run and get little jars of stain, so we, in England we use oak bark, but I found wattle bark here does just the same. You get the wattle bark, cut it into strips and boil it up. And it makes a beautiful brown stain. Now you just watch.
Perfect.
Ken is retired now and only makes a few saddles to keep him occupied. He was only too pleased to pass on some of his art to the willing students that he taught at the Elizabeth Technical College last year. So maybe the saddlemaker's craft will be revived again.
There. Now we put a thinner piece of leather under there, very thin, punch a hole there, and that bar is recessed. My point in making that recess is, I find that by making that, that's easier for the rider to get the stirrup leather on, like that. And there's not the big lump, and the flap is not distorted, you see, that way. It sits better. If one just simply cuts a hole in, there's a ruck in the saddle flap. That's the point of that. And I find it rides better for the person itself on the thigh. It doesn't protrude so much. We're now going to put the panel in, that is, which we've made this afternoon. If we're lucky, we put that in there. That in there, we just always check to see if they fit. They do. We measured them. Good. That's the sort of thing. Lovely. Good. Good. The next thing is the last job we've got to do. Stuff it. Good.
Traditional cotton stuffing is used for the job.
Now, stuffing this saddle, one does think that you just ram it in just indiscriminately, but it's not so. The idea is to get it in little pieces and often. It's rather an experienced job to stuff them up. It comes with experience. You just don't ram it in so it's lumps and bumps. It's got to be level on the horse's back. Otherwise, it doesn't fit right, and it produces sores on the horse's back. It mustn't come up like that. It's got to be flat. The horse's back is completely flat.
The job of stuffing the saddle panel takes hours, and it is something that cannot be rushed. The final operation in the week's hard work is to sew the panel to the saddle frame, and another handcrafted Howard saddle is completed.
There you are, mission completed. Yes. Now we're going to just take the money for it. Good morning.
Good morning. God bless.
Good.
Oh, that's nice.
There's your saddle, my dear.
Very nice. Good, thank you very much.
That's all right.
Yes, it's
We've got the bill to come now. Yes. No, it should do. It'll settle down after the first couple of hours riding.
Yes.
It'll settle down. The tree was measured to fit the horse, so everything is all right.
Ken Howard is proud of every saddle he makes. He designed and made the saddles for the Australian Olympic equestrian team. One of the only old-time saddle makers in Australia, Ken Howard is still carrying on a 200-year-old family skill in Elizabeth Downs in South Australia.
We received a letter from Bronwyn Haddock of Maruka in Queensland. It says quite simply, last Christmas our family went to Sydney. While we were there we saw old Sydney town. We enjoyed it so much, I'm sure a lot of other people would like to see it too. Well, we're going to take a look at Old Sydney Town for you, and there we can step back almost 190 years to the early 1780s. Here, an attempt to reproduce as closely as possible life in early Sydney Town has resulted in a living museum which represents the birth of Australia. All buildings in the colonial town are made in the same way as they would have been 190 years ago. If thatch roofs were used then the same techniques have been used to build these dwellings. Wandering down the streets of Old Sydney Town, the visitor is confronted with a variety of characters representing the different types of the period.
Oh, you could have a lucky horseshoe. Look at that. Haven't got that. Look at this. Come on.
The colony was founded as a jail to house convicts from England, and their labour was used to build most of the town and its buildings. Most of the modest dwellings in the village were used by craftsmen, like the candlemaker. Here at Old Sydney Town, buildings like this are set up and used to demonstrate these old-time trades. The candlemaker was a vital individual in the colonial days, for even though oil lamps did exist, candles were the most widely used form of lighting.
Oh, and it needs to be fairly cool so that it builds up quickly. Into the warm wax and into the cold water. That hardens each layer. The wax very slowly to avoid the bumps and lumps. I think this might be the final dip. A nice pair of tapers. A pair of beeswax candles that size would burn for several hours. The beeswax has a long burning life. That's longer than the tallow. They would burn for 5, 6, 7 hours. Cool them off in the water and the completed candle.
Heating, of course, was provided by the wood fire, and the roof of the primitive dwellings consisted of wooden shingles. Another method of making candles was to use a tin mould and pour the beeswax around the tallow wick. When the wax has set, the mould is immersed in boiling water and the completed candle is easily removed.
Beeswax.
Outside in the streets of Old Sydney Town, life is not so gentle, at least for some. Visitors are quickly reminded of the harsh way of life in the convict settlement.
What do you want?
You gotta get it good. You decided to go jet diligence.
Is that right?
Now get him out.
Well, you better come and get it. Come on. Come on out.
Wagon driver. Get him on the car.
Wait.
There were essentially two types of people in colonial Sydney, the imprisoned and the free. The soldiers were on the lowest order of the free people, and some of them were not much better than the convicts they had in their charge. Many convicts, like the candlemaker, were transported to Australia for stealing as little as 1 copper saucepan and an apron worth about 25 cents.
You gotta get it good. You've been stealing shingles. There's justice, eh? You gotta get down from there.
If you want me, you'll have to come up.
Very well. Spriggs, you do your duty.
Please, Spriggs, you can't do that, Spriggs.
Do it. You gotta come down, Matthew. He won't be stealing any more shingles, Sergeant.
Justice was not always done, but the soldiers frequently administered their own kind of justice.
I don't know you can stand the smell getting that close to it. Well, out of the way. Come on, pal.
All those arrested in the streets are taken to an official court, and there they are tried, and if found guilty, punished on the spot. This street theatre is a daily feature at Old Sydney Town and never fails to draw a large audience of visitors.
But the left big right soft. What's wrong with you? Hands, you great soft thing. Cry, that's what you are, cry, baby. You get yours, you get yours. Oh, shit, come on.
And the public gallery may be seated. Please, Mark. You haven't been praying for it, I hope, Reverend? Very well. Would you read the charge, please, Mr. Clark?
Elizabeth Bartlett, you are charged by the Reverend Marsden with robbing him of a considerable quantity of wine, pewter plate, and other articles over an indeterminate period of time. How do you plead?
I'm not guilty, sir.
Very well, enter a plea of not guilty.
The courtroom drama is acted out daily to an enthusiastic audience.
Kelly came to the door and asked me to join them for a drink. Well, I told him that I didn't drink and that if Reverend Marsden found out, he'd be very upset. And then again last night as I was going to my room, I met Doherty and he said it was a pity that I wouldn't have a drink with me.
In this case, an acquittal is achieved.
I can go now, sir.
Yes, Mistress Bartlett, you may go.
Thank you. Excuse me, Reverend, may I come back and work for you, sir?
Yes, my dear, I fear that I've done you a little injustice.
Injustice is an interesting word by 20th century standards. The fate of those found guilty was extremely harsh.
Time up. Hands! He is sentenced to receive 200 lashes. Like you be stupid.
Get up, man, get up! You ever heard of Bill's Red Scream Hunt? Well, you're gonna hear it now.
Scum. Get him out of here.
We'll be back in a moment for more of Old Sydney Town. Each of the craftsmen's houses in the village represents a dwelling of a real person that lived in Sydney town of convict days. Here lives George Dowling, a tinsmith. The tinsmith was an important tradesman in the town. He made simple household things like mugs, dishes, kettles and candle holders. He works with sheet metals of tin, brass, copper and pewter. Here all the finished wares are for sale, and as each must be produced using the same implements which were available in the day, the man-hours involved in each piece is considerable. These brass objects are for potting plants, and when finished with wall-mounting brackets will be for sale to visitors. In the streets of Old Sydney town, life is never dull, and visitors have a chance to get really involved in some of the activities. No look at the infant settlement of Sydney will be complete without the waterfront, for the tiny colony was for many years totally dependent on the ships from England for its survival. Sailing ships like this one made the hazardous journey halfway around the world carrying supplies for the isolated settlement. a new ship docked, it was a big event for the whole community. Not only did it bring fresh food, but also news, and sometimes letters from relatives. A letter written to someone in England would take 2 years to produce a reply. Another activity which fascinates visitors is pit sawing. Here, the top notcher, standing on top of the timber, lifts the saw, while the underdog pulls the saw on the downward stroke. This building is a replica of the observatory built in 1788 and was originally used to make astronomical observations. It was operated by Lieutenant William Dorse, who sent back information to the British Board of Longitude. In the small octagonal observatory is a quadrant used for taking star altitude readings. It had a clear view of the night sky by opening a shutter in the roof. To enable the quadrant to cover all sectors of the sky, the roof of the odd-shaped building rotates and uses cannonballs for bearings. The management of Old Sydney Town, through their authenticity of buildings and attention to detail, tried to convey the feeling of actually visiting an isolated pocket of civilization in a hostile and little understood new land. A new land which meted out death to many of its first inhabitants, but gave birth to a nation.
Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland brothers. Come on, me in it and join in the fun. Travel all over Australia.